Millionaire visits his mother in the hospital, then sees his ex-wife with triplets next door and is stunned, unable to move. The hospital hallway was quieter than Dr. Montserrat expected. No ringing phones, no rushing footsteps, just the low hum of machines and the soft squeak of his shoes against polished floors as he walked toward his mother's room. He had been in buildings far more intimidating than this. Boardrooms filled with people waiting for his approval, conference halls where his name carried weight. Yet this narrow corridor made his chest feel tight in a way nothing else ever had. He slowed his pace without realizing it. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something warm, almost comforting. Nurses moved past him with calm efficiency, their faces gentle but distant, as if they had learned how to stay close to pain without letting it touch them. Dr. Montserrat checked the room number again. Just a few steps more. That was when he looked to his left, and everything stopped. Dr. Montserrat stood still in the middle of the hallway, one hand still hovering near his pocket where his phone rested. He didn't realize he had stopped walking until a nurse had to gently step around him. His body refused to cooperate, not because he was tired, not because he felt weak, but because his mind had not caught up with what his eyes were seeing. His breath came shallow, uneven, as if the simple act of inhaling now required effort. His shoulders remained tense, locked in the posture of someone always ready to move, always prepared to make the next decision. Yet for the first time in years he had no idea what to do next. People passed him, a wheelchair rolled by. A door opened and closed somewhere behind him. He didn't hear any of it. All he could feel was the strange heaviness in his legs, as though they no longer belonged to him. He had spent most of his life controlling rooms, situations, outcomes. Now he couldn't even command his own body to take a single step forward. The woman stood a few steps away from him, just outside one of the patient rooms. At first he noticed the children before he noticed her. 3 small figures clustered around her legs, each holding onto her in a different way. One gripped her hand tightly. Another leaned against her hip. The smallest rested in her arms, fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater. They were quiet, not restless, not crying, just close. Then his eyes moved upward, and his chest tightened. Lena. The name surfaced in his mind before his heart could react. She looked older, but not in a way that felt heavy. There were faint lines near her eyes, the kind that came from years of smiling more than worrying. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling around her face the same way they always had. She was speaking softly to the child in her arms, her voice low, gentle, steady, the kind of voice people used when they wanted someone to feel safe. He watched her nod, brush a hand across one child's shoulder, then shift the weight of the smallest one slightly higher on her hip. The movement was natural, practiced. This wasn't a visitor holding someone else's kids for a moment. This was a mother, and she was holding 3 of them. For a few seconds, his mind rejected the scene entirely, not in panic, not in fear, just quiet refusal. This couldn't be real. The hallway, the children, Lena standing there like she belonged in this moment and not in a memory, none of it made sense to him. His heartbeat slowed, then stumbled, as if it had forgotten its rhythm. A dull pressure formed behind his eyes, not quite pain, more like the feeling of standing up too fast after sitting too long. He swallowed, but his throat felt dry. 8 years, that was how long it had been since he had last seen her, since her face had belonged to his present instead of his past. And now she was here, alive, real, close enough that he could see the familiar curve of her smile, even from where he stood. His fingers twitched slightly, as though they wanted to reach for something that no longer existed. He felt light but also rooted to the floor, as if the world had shifted forward without him, and he had only just noticed. His first instinct was to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen her, to continue walking, to focus on his mother, on the reason he was here. That was the logical response. This was none of his business anymore. Her life had moved on. His had done the same. There was no reason for their paths to cross again. That was what his mind told him. But his heart didn't listen. His heart was busy replaying old moments, her laugh in their kitchen, the way she used to wait up for him even when she was exhausted, the look on her face the night she said she felt lonely standing beside him. Logic said, "You lost this. Let it go." His heart whispered, "You never really understood what you lost." He felt the pull in 2 directions. One part of him wanted to step back, create distance, protect himself from a feeling he had buried for years. Another part wanted to stay exactly where he was, just to be sure she was real, just to be sure this moment wasn't something his mind had created out of regret and memory. He hadn't said a word, he hadn't moved an inch, but inside him 2 versions of his life were standing face to face. And right there, in that quiet pause between who he used to be and who he had become, his story truly begins. Hello, and welcome to Mr. Williams Storytime. Today's story isn't about money. It isn't about fame. And it isn't about success in the way we usually measure it. It's about a moment, the kind of moment that arrives without warning, the kind that forces you to look at your life and realize that some of the most important chapters didn't end the way you thought they did. Dr. Montserrat walked into that hospital believing he was prepared for anything. He was wrong, because sometimes the hardest things we face aren't emergencies or crises or losses. Sometimes the hardest thing is simply standing still and realizing the person you once loved built an entire life without you. And if you've ever had a moment like that, where life paused for just a second and made you question everything you thought you knew about your choices, then this story is for you. So before we continue, take a moment to support the channel. If stories like this make you feel something real, go ahead and tap the like button. It helps more people find these stories, and it lets me know to keep bringing you narratives that matter. And if you're new here, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime so you never miss a story that reminds you how powerful, complicated, and meaningful ordinary life can be. Now let's go back to where it all began. Before the hospital, before the success, before the years that changed everything. They met in a place neither of them remembered clearly at first. Not a dramatic setting, not a special occasion, just a small cafe near the university campus, one of those places where the chairs never quite matched and the music was always a little too soft. Dr. Montserrat was there for the free Wi-Fi. Lena was there because her friend worked behind the counter and promised her a discount. Their first conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. He asked if the seat across from her was taken. She said no. He thanked her, sat down, and immediately spilled coffee on his notebook. She laughed before she could stop herself. Not the polite kind of laugh, the real kind, the one that escapes without permission. He looked up, embarrassed, and smiled in return. That was it. No fireworks, no dramatic entrance, just two people sharing an awkward moment in a crowded room. But something about it felt easy. They talked about classes, then about nothing, then about everything. He told her about the business ideas he scribbled in that notebook. She told him about her training at the hospital and how tired she was of memorizing anatomy terms. They exchanged numbers without making a big deal out of it. Later that night, he realized he was still smiling at his phone, and somewhere across the city, Lena was too. Their first few dates cost almost nothing. Walks through quiet streets after sunset, shared fries at a diner that stayed open too late, sitting on the hood of his old car, counting planes in the sky and guessing where they were headed. They didn't need much to feel close. Sometimes they would sit in silence, just listening to music through one pair of headphones, leaning against each other without saying a word. Other times they talked for hours about the kind of lives they wanted to live. Not grand plans, just small wishes, a job they didn't hate, enough money to pay rent without stress. Time to travel someday. Once he took her to a park and admitted he had forgotten his wallet. She smiled, bought 2 ice creams, and said, "You can pay me back when you're rich." Neither of them believed that sentence would one day carry so much weight. Back then, happiness felt light. It fit easily into moments that didn't need to be planned. They moved in together sooner than either of them expected, not because it was practical, not because it made sense, but because neither of them liked going home without the other. The apartment was small enough that they could stand in the kitchen and touch opposite walls at the same time. The couch had a loose spring that made a quiet noise whenever someone shifted their weight. The heater worked only when it wanted to, but to them, it felt perfect. They filled the space slowly. A second-hand table from a thrift store, a lamp that flickered if you bumped it, a plant Lena insisted on buying even though neither of them knew how to take care of it. Some nights they cooked together, sharing one pan and too many opinions. Other nights they ate instant noodles on the floor because they were too tired to wash dishes. He worked late on his ideas, typing quietly while she studied nearby, her feet resting on his lap. Every so often she would read something out loud and ask if it made sense. He would pretend to listen, then apologize, then actually listen. They didn't have much, but they had each other in every small moment. And at the time, that felt like more than enough. Even in those early days, the difference between them was already there. Not in conflict, not in arguments, just in how they looked at time. Dr. Montserrat was always thinking ahead, what his life could become, where he wanted to be in 5 years. Which ideas might turn into something real. Lena thought in terms of now. She noticed when the sun hit the kitchen window just right in the mornings. She paid attention to how his mood shifted after long days. She remembered small details, what songs made him relax, which foods he avoided when he was stressed. He admired that about her. but he didn't understand it. When she suggested taking a day off to go somewhere nearby, he often replied, "Maybe next month, when things calm down." She usually smiled and said okay. But next month rarely came. He was building something. She was living something. Neither of them realized yet that both approaches came with a cost. Despite their differences, there were moments that felt quietly perfect. On nights when the city was loud, they would turn off all the lights and sit by the window, watching reflections move across the glass. Lena would rest her head on his shoulder, and he would wrap an arm around her without thinking. Sometimes she talked about her patience, not details, just feelings, how hard it was to watch people struggle, how much she wanted to make a difference even in small ways. He listened, really listened. Other times, he spoke about his ideas, his fears of failing, his need to prove that he was capable of more. She never laughed at his dreams, never rushed him. She just reminded him to eat, to sleep, to breathe. Once, during a power outage, they lit candles and played a game where they took turns asking each other questions. "What scares you the most?" she asked. He thought for a long time before answering. "Ending up ordinary." She smiled gently and replied, "I'm scared of ending up alone." They didn't realize it then, but those two answers described the entire future they were walking toward, from opposite directions. One night, after another long day, they ended up on opposite ends of the couch. The TV was on, but neither of them was watching. Dr. Monserrate sat with his laptop balanced on his knees, answering emails. Lena had a blanket pulled over her legs, scrolling through her phone without really reading anything. Minutes passed without a word. Then Lena broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" He didn't look up right away. "Yeah, sure." She hesitated, then spoke softly. "Do you remember the last time we went to bed at the same time?" He paused, thinking. The answer didn't come easily. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that meant happiness. It was gentle, careful, like she didn't want to start a fight. "I know you're working hard," she said, "and I'm proud of you. I really am. But sometimes," she continued, "I don't need big plans or future promises. I just need you to come home before midnight sometimes." The room felt suddenly very still. He closed his laptop and reached for her hand. "I'm doing this for us," he said. "Just a little longer." She nodded and leaned her head against his shoulder. But something about the way she nodded felt different, as if she had agreed to wait for something she no longer believed would arrive. After that night, nothing changed on the surface. They still lived together, but the tone shifted in ways that were easy to ignore. Lena stopped asking him to come home early. She stopped suggesting plans weeks in advance. She stopped reminding him about things he used to forget. Not out of anger, out of adjustment. She learned how to fall asleep alone, how to eat without waiting, how to fill the quiet with her own routines. Dr. Monserrate noticed the difference, but he interpreted it as understanding. She's being patient, he thought. She gets it now. What he didn't notice was how her laughter became softer, how her questions became fewer, how her expectations slowly faded into acceptance. There were no arguments to signal danger, just small changes that felt harmless. Two people in the same room, still close enough to touch, but no longer reaching for each other the way they used to. And without realizing it, they had already begun practicing life apart. The change didn't arrive with noise or celebration. It came quietly, disguised as opportunity. One email led to a meeting. One meeting led to another. Then came late nights, early mornings, and a calendar that filled itself faster than he could keep up. At first, Dr. Monserrate was excited. This was what he had worked for. The chance to prove himself, the chance to build something real instead of just talking about it. He started coming home with stories about potential investors, new partners, fresh ideas. Lena listened, asked questions, smiled in all the right places. She was proud of him, and he loved that she believed in him. Soon, his phone became an extension of his hand. Messages arrived during dinner. Calls interrupted conversations. His laptop followed him from room to room, always open, always waiting. He told himself it was temporary. Just this project, just this phase, just until things stabilized. But each success created another reason to stay busy, another goal, another deadline, another promise that things would slow down later. And without noticing, the future he kept chasing began replacing the present he was already living in. At first, he tried to keep things balanced. He scheduled calls around meals. He promised to be home by certain times. He sent messages when meetings ran late. But work has a way of expanding into any space you give it. Soon, dinner became something he rushed through instead of shared. Lena would set the table, light a candle, and wait with her phone beside her plate. Sometimes he made it. Sometimes he sent a short message, running late. "Don't wait up." At first, she replied with heart emojis and understanding words. Later, she just replied with okay. The candle stopped appearing. The meals became colder. And when he finally came home, he often found her asleep on the couch, the TV still on, a blanket pulled up to her shoulders. He would stand there for a moment, watching her breathe, wondering how someone could feel so close and so distant at the same time. Then he would quietly go to bed, telling himself he would make it up to her tomorrow. Lena learned how to wait without making it obvious. She stopped checking the clock so often, stopped refreshing her messages every few minutes, stopped setting expectations that kept getting disappointed. Instead, she created small routines that didn't depend on him. She ate while watching shows she liked. She went for evening walks by herself. She kept a book on the nightstand for the nights he wasn't there. When he finally came home, she smiled and asked how his day went, not because she wasn't hurt, but because she didn't want to become someone who complained all the time. Some nights she stayed awake just to hear the door open. Other nights she slept through it completely, and each time that happened, a small part of her adjusted again, learning how to exist without needing his presence to feel whole. Dr. Montserrat noticed she seemed calmer, less demanding, less emotional, more independent. He thought this meant she was finally comfortable with his schedule. He didn't realize it meant she was slowly preparing for a life where his schedule no longer mattered. Their conversations began to change, not in content, but in rhythm. Lena would talk about her day, a patient who reminded her of her father, a coworker who brought homemade food, a small mistake she kept thinking about. Dr. Montserrat listened while glancing at his phone. He nodded at the right moments. He responded with short comments. He asked questions that sounded supportive but didn't invite deeper discussion. She noticed, so she shortened her stories. Then she stopped sharing certain things altogether. Instead of talking, she asked him about his work, his meetings, his plans, his goals. The conversations became centered around his life. Her thoughts stayed inside her. Sometimes she caught herself starting a sentence, then stopping midway because she knew he wasn't fully present. Eventually, silence felt easier than repeating herself. They still talked every day, but only one of them felt truly heard. Part 3 of 5, Emotional Invisibility. Lena began to feel like she was fading in a room that was still full, not ignored, not mistreated, just unseen. Dr. Montserrat didn't notice when she cut her hair. Didn't realize she stopped playing music while cooking. Didn't remember the last movie they watched together. She stopped expecting him to. When she felt overwhelmed, she learned to sit with it alone. When she was excited about something small, she celebrated quietly, not because he didn't care, but because he was rarely available in the moments that mattered to her. She was still there every day, still loving him, still supportive, yet it felt as though she was slowly turning into background noise in her own relationship, present in space, absent in meaning. Dr. Montserrat noticed the distance, but he explained it away. He told himself this was normal, that every couple went through phases, that real relationships required patience and sacrifice. When Lena seemed quieter, he assumed she was tired. When she stopped initiating conversations, he believed she was simply giving him space. He reminded himself of his intentions. I'm doing this for us. This will secure our future. Once things stabilize, I'll slow down. These thoughts made him feel responsible, even noble. He wasn't neglecting her, he believed. He was building something for both of them. He focused on the destination, while the relationship was quietly losing its present. The moment came on an ordinary evening. No argument, no raised voices, no dramatic trigger. They were sitting across from each other at the small kitchen table, both tired, both quiet. Lena had barely touched her food. Dr. Montserrat was answering emails between bites. She watched him for a while before speaking. Can I tell you something without you trying to fix it? He looked up, surprised. Okay. She took a breath. I feel like a memory in your life instead of a person. The words hung between them. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? She searched for the right way to explain it. It's like, you talk about me when you're explaining your story to other people, but when you're actually here, I don't feel part of it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I know you're working hard, she said quickly. I know you're doing your best. I'm not accusing you of anything. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. But I miss you even when you're sitting right in front of me. He reached for her hand. She let him hold it, but her eyes were already somewhere else. After that conversation, nothing exploded. There were no ultimatums, no threats, no emotional outbursts. They went to bed that night like they always did. He kissed her forehead. She whispered goodnight. But something had shifted in a way neither of them fully understood. Lena stopped hoping that things would return to how they used to be. She no longer waited for change. She adapted to the reality in front of her. Dr. Montserrat believed the conversation had been resolved simply because it hadn't turned into a conflict. He felt relieved. She felt resigned. From the outside, their life looked stable. From the inside, one of them had already begun to let go, not of love, but of the idea that love alone could fix what absence had created. And without realizing it, they crossed a line that would be impossible to return from. The end of their marriage didn't begin with anger. There was no sudden discovery, no raised voices echoing through the apartment, no moment where everything fell apart at once. It started with a conversation that felt almost too calm to be dangerous. They were sitting in the living room, the same couch where they had once shared dreams and jokes. The TV was off. The room felt unusually quiet, like it was waiting for something to be said. Lena spoke first. Dr. Montserrat didn't interrupt. He sensed the weight in her tone, the kind that meant this wasn't just another passing thought. She continued, "I feel like I've been living beside you instead of with you." He wanted to argue, to explain, to promise change. But for the first time, he noticed how steady her voice was. Not emotional, not accusing, just honest. There was no betrayal behind her words, no resentment, only a quiet truth that had been forming for a long time, and that somehow made it harder than any argument ever could. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a slow admission of fatigue. Lena spoke about how tired she felt trying to stay connected when the connection no longer felt mutual, how she kept adjusting her expectations, hoping one day they would meet reality again. Dr. Montserrat listened, but this time without distractions, no phone, no emails, just her words landing one by one. "I don't have the energy to keep waiting," she said quietly. "Not because you're a bad person, but because I'm losing myself trying to be patient." He felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest, not anger, not denial, just the realization that love alone hadn't been enough to protect them from drifting apart. They weren't breaking because of something dramatic. They were breaking because both of them were tired of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And in that shared exhaustion, the end felt less like a choice and more like a consequence that had finally caught up with them. They sat together long after the words ran out. No one rushed to leave the room. No one stood up in frustration. It felt important to stay still, as if movement might make the moment too real. Dr. Montserrat was the one who spoke next. "Are you saying you want to leave?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She looked at the wall, then at the floor, then finally at him. "I'm saying I don't know how to stay anymore." Her voice didn't shake. That was what unsettled him the most. He asked about counseling, about taking time off, about changing his schedule. She listened to every suggestion with care, not resistance. "I believe you mean all of that," she said gently. "I just don't think I can wait for it to happen again." There was no blame in her tone, only a quiet certainty that something inside her had already made peace with the decision. They weren't arguing about whether the relationship mattered. They were acknowledging that it had already become something neither of them recognized anymore. The question escaped his mouth before he could stop it. "Do you still love me?" Lena looked at him for a long time, not searching for an answer, not trying to avoid the truth, just feeling the weight of what he was really asking. "Yes," she said. "I do." The word landed softly, but it carried years of meaning. He felt both relieved and confused. "Then why is this happening?" he asked. She took a breath. "Because love isn't supposed to feel like I'm waiting for permission to matter." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes glistened slightly. "I still care about you," she continued. "That's exactly why I don't want to turn into someone who feels empty standing next to the person she loves." He didn't know how to respond. The truth was clear. They still loved each other. But love had stopped being enough to hold them together. They sat in silence again, the kind that doesn't feel awkward, just heavy. Lena broke it gently. "I don't want to leave because I'm angry," she said. "I don't want to leave because I've given up." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want to leave because love shouldn't feel this lonely." Dr. Montserrat felt the sentence settle deep inside him. He thought about all the nights she had waited, all the conversations he had half heard, all the moments he had promised to make up for later. He realized that from her perspective, loneliness hadn't come from being alone. It had come from being together and still feeling invisible. "I never meant to make you feel that way," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. "That's what makes this harder." There was no enemy in the room, just two people who had loved each other honestly, and still ended up on different sides of the same reality. They didn't pack bags that night. They didn't argue over who would keep what. They just sat there, letting the truth settle in slowly. Lena was the first to stand up. "I'll stay with a friend for a while," she said. "Not because I'm angry, I just need space to breathe." Dr. Montserrat nodded, even though his chest felt tight. "Take whatever you need," he replied. "We can sort the rest later." She walked to the bedroom, returned with a small bag, and paused at the door. For a moment, it looked like she might say something else. Then she stepped forward and hugged him. Not tightly, not desperately, just long enough to say goodbye without words. "I hope you find everything you're looking for," she said softly. He wanted to say the same. But all that came out was, "I'm sorry." She smiled gently. "I know." And then she walked out. The door closed behind her with a sound so quiet it barely registered. Yet in that silence, an entire chapter of their lives ended. And if this part of the story feels heavy, it's because moments like this happen more often than we like to admit. Not every ending comes with drama. Not every goodbye comes with anger. Some goodbyes are quiet, and those are usually the ones that stay with us the longest. Tap the like button if you've ever loved someone but still had to let them go. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're enjoying this kind of emotional storytelling, make sure you're subscribed to Mr. Williams' Storytime so you don't miss the next chapter. Because the story isn't over yet. In fact, this is only where two very different lives begin. The first few weeks after she left were the hardest. Not because Lena missed the apartment. Not because she questioned her decision. But because silence finally had space to speak. She stayed with a close friend at first, sleeping in a spare room that smelled faintly of laundry soap and unfamiliar pillows. At night, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of someone else's life continuing around her. For the first time in years, she didn't have to wait for anyone to come home. That felt strange, and also relieving. She cried in small moments, while folding clothes, while standing in grocery lines, while brushing her teeth in the mornings. Not out of regret, but out of release. It was the kind of crying that happens when you stop holding your breath after a long time. Slowly, she began doing things just for herself. Morning walks without checking the time, cooking meals she actually enjoyed, saying yes to plans instead of postponing them. She wasn't trying to forget Dr. Montserrat. She was trying to remember who she had been before she learned how to wait for someone else's life to make room for her own. And with each small choice, she felt herself coming back. Not as someone new, but as someone she had misplaced for a while. As the weeks turned into months, Lena noticed a quiet shift inside herself. She woke up without that familiar weight in her chest, the kind that came from wondering if today would finally be different. There was no schedule to adjust around someone else's absence, no plans that depended on someone showing up late. Her days became simple in the best way. She started taking long routes home from work just because she liked how the streets felt at sunset. She joined a small yoga class at a community center, even though she wasn't very good at it, and laughed at herself more than anyone else. She spent more time with friends she had slowly drifted away from. They talked about ordinary things, work stress, family, silly memories from years ago. Nothing dramatic, but everything felt real. She realized she wasn't constantly tired anymore, not physically, emotionally. She had energy for conversations, for hobbies, for quiet moments without needing to fill them with distractions. Living again didn't mean excitement every day. It meant peace in the spaces between. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt like her life belonged fully to her. Not to the future she had been waiting for, but to the present she was finally allowing herself to enjoy. She met Gabe on a day that wasn't special at all. No celebration, no big event. Just a normal afternoon at a small bookstore near her workplace. Lena was flipping through a novel when someone beside her reached for the same copy. They both laughed softly and apologized at the same time. "You can take it," she said. He smiled. "Only if you promise to tell me later whether it's any good." That was how it started. They talked for a few minutes between shelves about books they loved, about work, about how neither of them ever finished the reading lists they made for themselves. Gabe wasn't trying to impress her. He didn't ask for her number right away. He didn't make big statements. He simply asked if she wanted to grab coffee, and when she said yes, he showed up exactly when he said he would. There was something unfamiliar about that. Not exciting in a dramatic way, just steady. He listened when she spoke. He remembered small details. He didn't rush the conversation or check his phone every few minutes. For the first time since her marriage ended, Lena felt seen without needing to explain herself. Not chased, not convinced, just met, right where she already was. Their relationship grew slowly. No rushing, no pressure, no assumptions about where things had to go. Gabe didn't try to fill every space in Lena's life. He fit into it naturally, like someone who respected the shape it already had. They met for dinner once a week at first, then twice, then sometimes just to walk and talk without a destination. He asked questions and waited for real answers. He noticed when she was tired and suggested resting instead of pushing through. When Lena talked about her past, he didn't interrupt or compare himself. He simply listened. There were no long explanations needed, no effort to be understood. No feeling of being too much or not enough. With Gabe, affection felt calm. It didn't come with anxiety. It didn't depend on future promises. It existed fully in the moment they were sharing. And slowly, without any grand declaration, Lena realized she wasn't bracing herself anymore. She was just present, in a relationship that felt more like a partnership than a performance. Lena didn't notice the change all at once. It revealed itself in small moments. The way she spoke without rehearsing her thoughts first. The way she laughed without checking his reaction. The way silence felt comfortable instead of tense. With Gabe, she didn't feel like she had to earn attention. If she was quiet, he noticed. If she was excited, he shared it. If she was overwhelmed, he didn't rush to fix things. He stayed. One evening, after a long shift, she sat on his couch staring at nothing in particular. Gabe brought her a glass of water and placed it gently on the table. "You don't have to talk," he said. "I'm here anyway." That sentence stayed with her, not because it was dramatic, but because no one had ever said it to her so simply before. She realized that love didn't have to feel like waiting. It could feel like being held in the moment you already existed in. For the first time in years, Lena felt safe enough to be exactly who she was, without shrinking, without explaining, without hoping someone else would eventually catch up to her life. The idea of having children wasn't something Lena and Gabe planned right away. They talked about it in passing, casually, without timelines or pressure. More curiosity than commitment. Life, however, had its own rhythm. When Lena found out she was pregnant, she stared at the test for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. When the doctor later told her it wasn't 1 heartbeat but 3, she actually laughed out loud. "Are you serious?" she asked, thinking it was a mistake. Gabe looked just as stunned. Triplets. Not something you prepare for in advance, not something you schedule into a life. It was overwhelming, and frightening, and deeply unexpected. But for the first time, Lena didn't feel alone facing uncertainty. Gabe held her hand through every appointment. He learned everything he could. He asked questions, took notes, showed up, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand what they were stepping into together. Some nights Lena lay awake thinking about how different this was from the life she once imagined. Not better in a glamorous way, just fuller in a real one. 3 small lives were about to enter the world, not as part of a perfect plan, but as part of a relationship built on presence, patience, and showing up even when the future felt unclear. Life with 3 children arrived quickly and without warning. There was no gentle adjustment period. There were sleepless nights, mismatched socks, bottles left in strange places, and a constant background of small sounds, soft cries, tiny laughs, the shuffle of little feet learning how to move. The house was rarely quiet, but it felt alive. Lena learned how to function on broken sleep and cold coffee. Gabe learned how to change diapers with one hand while holding another child against his chest. They took turns. They laughed at things that would have felt stressful in another life. Some evenings, they all ended up on the living room floor, toys scattered around, the children climbing over them like they were part of the furniture. Lena watched Gabe build a small tower of blocks with one child, while the other 2 sat beside him, completely focused. He wasn't on his phone, he wasn't distracted. He was fully there, and in those ordinary moments, feeding, cleaning, comforting, repeating the same routines, Lena realized something quietly powerful. This wasn't the life she once imagined with Dr. Montserrat, but it was the life where she finally felt included in her own story. As time passed, their days settled into a gentle rhythm. Not perfect, not effortless, just steady. Mornings were busy but warm. One child insisted on the same cereal every day. Another refused to wear anything without stripes. The third followed Lena everywhere, holding onto the edge of her sweater like a quiet shadow. Gabe made breakfast while Lena packed bags. Sometimes they forgot things. Sometimes they laughed about it later. Evenings were slower. They sat at the table together, the children talking at once, their voices overlapping in a way that made no sense but felt comforting. Afterward, there were baths, stories, soft lights, and whispered goodnights. When the house finally became quiet, Lena and Gabe sat side by side on the couch. Not scrolling, not rushing to the next task, just sharing the silence. There were no grand conversations about the future, no constant planning, just a feeling that tomorrow didn't need to be better than today, because today was already enough. Lena still thought about her past sometimes, but it no longer felt like something she had lost. It felt like something that had gently led her to the life she was living now. A life that wasn't loud, just peaceful. Lena felt his presence before she saw him, not in a dramatic way. She had been focused on adjusting one child's jacket, making sure the zipper wasn't pressing against their neck. Another child was tugging at her sleeve, asking a question she didn't fully catch. Then she looked up and saw him standing a few steps away. Dr. Montserrat. For a moment her mind went blank, not with shock, not with fear, with recognition. 8 years disappeared in a single breath. She didn't step back, didn't turn away. She simply held her position, her hand still resting on her child's shoulder, as if grounding herself in the present before acknowledging the past. He looked different, more polished, more composed, but his eyes were the same, searching, uncertain, caught between what he expected to find and what he was actually seeing. She was the first to speak. "Hi, Montserrat." His name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, not because she had forgotten it, but because it no longer belonged to her life the way it once did. For a second, he didn't respond, not because he hadn't heard her, because he hadn't expected her to speak first. "Hi, Lena," he finally said, his voice softer than he intended. The words felt fragile, like they might break if he said anything else too quickly. They stood there facing each other, unsure of the distance they were supposed to keep. Too far felt cold, too close felt inappropriate, so they stayed exactly where they were. "I didn't know you were here," he added, gesturing vaguely around them. She nodded. "My daughter has an appointment, just a routine check." He glanced at the children again, this time more deliberately, 3 of them, all watching him with quiet curiosity. That's a lot," he said, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lena smiled back gently. "It is." Neither of them mentioned the past. Neither of them acknowledged how strange it was to see each other like this, older, changed, carrying lives that no longer intersected. Their greeting was polite, careful, 2 people trying not to step on memories that still felt too real to touch. They ended up sitting on a pair of chairs near the wall, close enough to talk, far enough to avoid feeling too familiar. The children stayed near Lena, one on her lap, the other 2 leaning against her legs. Dr. Montserrat sat across from them, his hands folded loosely, unsure where to place them. For a while no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. The hospital sounds filled the space between them, distant footsteps, a quiet announcement over the speakers, the soft opening and closing of doors. Dr. Montserrat studied the floor tiles. Lena watched the smallest child trace shapes with their finger on the armrest. Every few seconds their eyes met briefly, then drifted away again. It felt strange to share silence after so many years of distance. Once, silence between them had been comfortable. Now it felt careful. Neither of them wanted to be the first to break it. Afraid that whatever came out might open a door neither of them was prepared to walk through. Eventually, Lena spoke again. "So, how have you been?" It was a simple question, the kind people ask out of habit, but between them, it carried the weight of 8 years. Dr. Montserrat let out a small breath. "Good," he said, "busy, work mostly." She nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "I saw your name in an article a while back," she added. "Something about a new company." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, that was a big project. I'm glad it worked out for you." Her tone was sincere, not forced, not bitter. That surprised him more than anything else. "What about you?" he asked. "How have you been?" Lena looked down at the children, then back at him. "I've been okay. Life got different, but in a good way." He noticed how easily she said it. No hesitation, no explanation. They spoke in short sentences, careful not to reveal too much, careful not to reopen old patterns. Yet underneath the polite conversation, something else moved quietly. The recognition that they were both standing in lives that no longer required the other to exist. The question slipped out before he could measure it. "Are you happy?" Lena didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know, but because she wanted to answer honestly. She watched one child swing their legs slowly, another pressed their face against her arm. The smallest yawned and rested their head against her chest. Then she looked back at him. "I think I am," she said. He waited, expecting more. She added, "Not in a perfect way, not every day, but I feel settled." The word landed gently between them. Settled, not excited, not chasing, not proving anything, just steady. Dr. Montserrat nodded, even though something in his chest tightened. "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it. But the truth behind his smile was harder to face. She hadn't described a dream. She had described a life, one that no longer included him and didn't need to. One of the children looked at Dr. Montserrat for a long moment, not shy, just curious. "Mommy," the child said softly, tugging at Lena's sleeve. "Who's that man?" The question cut through the quiet more sharply than anything else that had been said. Dr. Montserrat felt his chest tighten. Lena froze for half a second. not because she didn't know the answer, but because she knew how many versions of the truth existed. She glanced at him, then back at her child. "An old friend," she said gently. The words were simple, clean, kind. The child nodded, satisfied, and returned to playing with the strap of Lena's bag. But Dr. Montserrat felt the weight of that sentence settle inside him. Old friend, not husband, not family, not part of their story, just someone from a time that no longer had a place in the present. He forced a small smile at the children. They smiled back without any awareness of what the moment meant, and for the first time, he fully understood something he had avoided for years. He wasn't missing a person anymore. He was missing an entire life that had continued without him. After that, the conversation slowed, not because it had reached an end, but because neither of them felt ready to continue. The words "old friend" stayed in the air longer than anything else they had said. Dr. Montserrat shifted slightly in his chair, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt sitting there, dressed in a suit that belonged to meetings and decisions, not waiting rooms and quiet families. Lena adjusted the child in her arms, pressing a soft kiss against their hair without thinking. The gesture was small, but it carried more meaning than any explanation ever could. He watched her do it, not with jealousy, not with anger, with recognition. This wasn't a role she was learning. This was who she had become. And for the first time since he had seen her standing in the hallway, he felt something settle inside him, not sharply, not dramatically. Just a calm, heavy understanding. She wasn't the person he had lost. She was the person he had never stayed long enough to grow alongside. And the weight of that truth didn't crush him. It simply stayed with him, quiet and unavoidable, like a thought that no longer needed to be argued with. A nurse stepped out of a nearby room and called a name that wasn't theirs. The sound broke the moment. Lena stood up slowly, adjusting the bag on her shoulder and guiding the children to their feet. "That's us," she said, glancing toward the door. Dr. Montserrat rose as well, a second too late, unsure whether he was supposed to say something meaningful or simply step aside. "It was good to see you," he said. She nodded. "You too. I hope your mother is doing okay. Thank you. I hope everything goes well for your daughter." They stood there for one final second, not close enough to touch, not far enough to feel like strangers. Then Lena turned and walked toward the room, the children following her without hesitation, their hands still wrapped around hers. Dr. Montserrat watched until the door closed. The hallway returned to its earlier stillness, but he felt different standing in it now, not shocked, not frozen, just quietly changed. Because in that brief meeting, he hadn't discovered something new about Lena. He had discovered something new about himself, that some losses don't come from dramatic endings. They come from ordinary days where you choose not to be present until presence is no longer an option. That night, Dr. Montserrat returned to his apartment alone. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually felt comforting. The elevator rose smoothly, the lights soft and warm, the walls clean and untouched by any sign of real life. He unlocked his door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly where it should be. The furniture arranged perfectly, the glass surfaces spotless, the city glowing through the wide windows like a distant painting. It was the kind of place people dreamed about. And yet, as he set his keys down on the counter, the silence felt heavier than it ever had before. No voices from another room, no familiar footsteps, no one asking how his day went. He walked through the apartment slowly, not because he was tired, but because he didn't know where else to go. For years, this space had represented achievement. Now it felt like proof of how little he had learned to share his life beyond success. He sat on the edge of the couch and looked around. For the first time, the apartment didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a waiting room, a place between what he had built and what he had quietly lost. He turned on the lights, one room at a time. The bedroom looked untouched, the bed perfectly made, the side tables clear except for a single book he never finished. The kitchen held food he barely remembered buying, arranged neatly in the refrigerator, still sealed, still waiting. Everything in the apartment was clean. Too clean. There were no half-finished conversations left behind, no forgotten cups on the table, no signs that another life had ever existed here. Dr. Montserrat stood in the center of the living room, hands resting on his hips as if expecting the space to respond to him. It didn't. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt indifferent. He realized that he had designed his life for efficiency, not connection, for comfort, not presence. Every object around him served a purpose, but none of them held a story. No laughter trapped in the walls, no shared routines, no memories that required more than one person to exist. For the first time, he understood that emptiness wasn't about being alone. It was about having nothing in your life that needed you to be there. As he stood there, small moments began to surface. Not in order, not with force, just quietly, one after another. Lena sitting on the edge of the couch, waiting for him to finish a call. Lena asking if he wanted tea, already knowing the answer. Lena falling asleep with a book open on her chest because she didn't want to go to bed alone. He remembered how she used to hum while cooking, how she always folded laundry in neat stacks, even when he tossed his clothes wherever there was space. None of these memories were dramatic. They were ordinary, and that was what made them hurt. He realized he had spent years believing big achievements would create meaningful moments. But the moments that stayed with him now were the ones he had overlooked because they felt too small to matter at the time. He sat down slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time, he wasn't replaying memories to feel nostalgic. He was replaying them to understand something he had missed. That love hadn't asked him for perfection. It had asked him for presence, and he had been too busy preparing for the future to notice when the present was slowly slipping away. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He hadn't lost Lena in one moment. There was no single mistake he could point to. He had lost her in hundreds of small absences, in every dinner he skipped, every conversation he half listened to, every promise that began with later. He used to believe loss came from dramatic failures, from big arguments, from betrayal, from choosing the wrong path. But this loss was different. It came from choosing the right things for the wrong reasons. He had wanted to succeed so badly that he forgot to ask who he was succeeding for. Lena hadn't asked him to give up his dreams. She had only asked him to show up in the life they were already living. And now, standing in an apartment built from everything he once wanted, he finally understood what he had traded away. Not love, not opportunity, but the simple chance to be part of a life that didn't need to wait for him to arrive. For most of his life, success had meant one thing: progress, more contracts, more influence, more recognition. He had measured his worth by how much he could achieve and how quickly he could move forward. But sitting alone in that quiet space, the definition felt empty. None of his achievements could answer the questions now forming in his mind. Who was he when no one needed his results? Who was he when there was nothing left to prove? He realized that success had given him control, comfort, and status, but it hadn't taught him how to stay. It hadn't taught him how to listen without distraction, how to choose moments over milestones, how to understand that being present was not something you earned later. It was something you practiced every day. For the first time, he saw success not as a ladder to climb, but as a mirror, and the reflection it showed him was clear. He had built a powerful life, but he hadn't built a shared one. What surprised him most wasn't the sadness, it was the calm. He expected to feel angry with himself, to spiral into guilt, to wish he could rewrite everything. But instead, he felt something softer, acceptance, not of what he had done, but of what he had finally understood. He couldn't go back and change the past. He couldn't insert himself into the life Lena had built. He couldn't reclaim moments that no longer existed. And strangely, that didn't break him, because for the first time, he wasn't reacting. He was seeing. Seeing that regret wasn't useful if it stayed focused on what was lost, but clarity could shape what came next. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that once made him feel powerful. Now they felt distant, not meaningless, just incomplete. He realized that growth didn't always come from adding more to your life. Sometimes it came from noticing what you had failed to protect. And in that awareness, he felt lighter than he had in years, not because he was free from mistakes, but because he finally understood them. The next morning, Dr. Montserrat returned to the hospital, not because it was an emergency, not because anyone had called him, but because he wanted to be there. He arrived earlier than he had the day before, walking more slowly, paying attention to the people around him instead of rushing past them. The hallway felt the same, quiet, clean, familiar, but this time, it didn't make him feel disconnected. His mother was awake when he entered the room. She smiled when she saw him. Not a surprised smile, a knowing one. "You came early," she said. He nodded, pulling a chair closer to her bed. "I had time." She looked at him for a moment, as if measuring the truth behind his words. "You always had time," she said gently. "You just didn't always notice." He smiled faintly, accepting the honesty without defense. They talked about simple things, how she was feeling, what the doctors had said, a story from her childhood that he had heard before but listened to again anyway. This time, he didn't check his phone, didn't glance at the clock, didn't think about what he should be doing next. He stayed, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that presence wasn't something you scheduled around life. It was life. After that visit, small things began to change, not in dramatic ways, not with big announcements, just in the choices he made each day. He started leaving meetings a little earlier, not because they were less important, but because he realized some moments couldn't be postponed. He returned calls instead of sending messages. He listened fully instead of multitasking. He stayed present in conversations, even when they weren't about business or results. People noticed. A colleague once said, "You seem different lately." He smiled and replied, "I'm just trying to be where I am." He began accepting invitations he used to decline, dinner with friends, family gatherings, even quiet evenings without any agenda. At first it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to moving at this pace, but slowly he realized something. Life didn't feel smaller when he stopped chasing every opportunity. It felt fuller, because for the first time, his attention wasn't always divided between now and later. It was simply here. And in being here, he discovered a version of himself that didn't need constant motion to feel valuable, only connection. Choosing presence didn't happen all at once. It showed up in quiet decisions no one else noticed. He left his phone in another room during dinner. He sat through conversations without planning his reply. He asked people how they were and waited for real answers. Sometimes he caught himself drifting, thinking about tasks, deadlines, future plans. When that happened, he gently brought himself back. Not with discipline, with intention. He began taking walks without headphones, listening to the sounds of the city instead of filling every space with noise. He visited his mother more often, even when she told him not to worry. "I like knowing you're near," she said once, and for the first time, that felt more meaningful than any compliment he had ever received about his work. He realized presence wasn't about doing more for others. It was about offering the simplest thing, attention, without rushing to take it back. Not to impress, not to prove, just to be there while life happened. And in that stillness, he found something he had been chasing for years without knowing it, a sense of belonging that didn't come from achievement, but from being fully awake in the moments that were already his. He thought about Lena often, not in the way he used to think about unfinished business, not with the urge to fix or explain or rewrite the past, just with quiet understanding. He never reached out to her, not because he didn't care, but because he finally respected the life she had built without him. He knew now that contacting her wouldn't be about her. It would be about easing his own feelings, and he didn't want to turn her peace into a chapter of his growth story. Some things were meant to be honored from a distance. He wished her well in his thoughts, hoped the children were healthy, hoped she still felt the calm she had spoken about. And instead of trying to step back into a life that had already moved forward, he focused on living the one he still had, not with regret, with gratitude. Because loving someone didn't always mean staying in their life. Sometimes it meant knowing when not to enter it again. Over time, the change in him became less about effort and more about habit. He no longer felt the need to announce his growth or explain it to anyone. There was no audience for it, no scoreboard, just a series of small choices that slowly reshaped how he moved through the world. He started noticing details he once rushed past. The way sunlight hit the pavement in the mornings, the tone in someone's voice when they needed to be heard. The difference between being busy and being meaningful. He spent more time with people who didn't need anything from him except his company. Friends who talked about ordinary struggles. Family members who repeated old stories. Neighbors who waved just because. And for the first time, those moments felt valuable, not because they added to his success, but because they added to his life. There was no dramatic turning point, no final achievement that marked the change, just a quiet understanding that growth didn't have to be loud to be real. It could happen in silence, in listening, in staying, in choosing to be part of moments that didn't offer anything in return except connection. And somehow, that felt like the most meaningful success he had ever known. One evening, as he sat alone with a cup of tea growing cold in his hands, Dr. Montserrat thought about the word almost married forever, almost present, almost aware, almost there. For years, his life had been built on almosts, always close to something meaningful, but never fully inside it. He realized that most regrets weren't about big failures. They were about small absences, not calling when you should, not listening when it mattered, not staying when someone needed you more than your plans. He didn't feel bitter about the past. He felt grateful that he had finally understood it before it was too late to change how he lived now. Some lessons arrive after the door is closed, not to punish you, but to teach you how to knock differently on the next one. And in that quiet moment, with no one watching and nothing left to prove, he allowed himself to sit with the truth, that a meaningful life wasn't built by chasing what's next. It was built by staying with what's already here. And if this story stayed with you, even after the last line, then it means it touched something real. Maybe it reminded you of someone you once loved. Maybe it made you think about how you spend your time. Maybe it simply made you pause. If so, take a moment to share that feeling.